Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Back Your Play with Q. I'm your host, as always, Rich Quinones. Tuesday edition of BYP, hashtag BYP, and follow me on social media at RichQ on Q, IG, Twitter. Don't forget the YouTube channel. We're always brought to you on Tuesday from our good friends over at One With Like Tequila. They are women-owned, certified, organic, award-winning, ultra-premium tequila. Check them out online, onewithliketequila.com. Our NFL Insider kind enough to join us on what has turned out to be a very busy and just wild 24 to 48 hours, even 72 hours. That, of course, is Lloyd Vance kind enough to join us on a Tuesday edition of BYP. How are you?
Doing great, Q. This is a big week, in terms of the off season, and everybody is like, it's the non-football event of the season, the underwear Olympics, some of my football cronies call it, but it's the NFL Combine week, and everybody's in Indianapolis, and the movers and shakers there. So maybe there may be some movement in terms of free agency. There may be a lot of draft talk around, and then of course the franchise tag. So a lot to talk about.
Yeah, we'll get into all the player potential movement with the releasings and whatnot. And we know the draft writer on the corner. Really have to dive into this Daniel Snyder story, which just gets more bizarre by the moment. I mean, think about this. This is a guy that bought the Redskins for $800 million back in 1999. And right now, this franchise, he can sell it if he wants for about $6 billion. Now, he's not going to sell it to Jeff Bezos because they don't like each other, but that's the story for another day. The report that comes out about the $55 million in loans, financial misconduct by Snyder, secret $55 million loan. And, for those that are not familiar, loans and lines of credit obtained without approval of, in this case, the Washington head of directors violates team shareholders agreement. So then the other story comes out that the NFL pretty much decided we're not going to investigate this. So it's already a bad look for Daniel Snyder because people have been saying, sell the team, sell the team. And now it's even a worse look for the NFL and the clown commish, who basically just kind of sat back, and it's almost as though you placate this guy. And Snyder, think about this, right? When everything came out about a year or so ago with the toxic environment and the culture within Washington and the alleged harassment with the cheerleaders and whatnot and female employees, Snyder came out like the friggin' rat that he is, and he says pretty much to the public and the media dangles the carrot that, what I would consider selling. Then the dust settles, the smoke clears, and he kind of reneges on it and he walks it back, and now he's not going to settle, right? So we can sit there and say it's chess, not checkers. But I mean, this guy is such a friggin' worm and such a disgrace. What is it going to take, for the rest of the NFL, the collective, I guess you could say that vote of the owners to force him to sell this franchise?
Yeah, Q, obviously, there's 32 of these owners, and it would probably take 24 majority in terms of impeaching an owner or something like that. I don't think it's ever really happened. What they would need to do, obviously, is get together and kind of force his hand, kind of like we talked about with Richardson, what happened with the Carolina Panthers and his improprieties, and they kind of banded together and said, look, you need to get rid of the team for the best of the league. So it's going to be interesting to see how they formulate this plan. Obviously, Snyder still has some allies with these owners. A couple of them are still in his, in his corner, and he kind of knows this because he always kind of thumbs his nose at it and he's like, I'm going to survive no matter what. He kind of transferred on paper the power of the team to his wife anyway, but it's just a mess situation down in Washington, and franchise kind of rudderless because of the owner, and you have a stoic head coach there in Ron Rivera who's trying to hold together, but season after season it just gets uglier and uglier, and eventually I do think he will have to sell a team, but it's going to take a lot of pressure. And as always, Q, it's going to be monetary based. Will the other owners come together and get enough money to say, okay, is this enough on the table for you to leave and step away from a thing that's been your lifelong dream, and you've done it for so long with, Snyder? Hopefully he'll eventually step away. But as you were talking about, it's just incident after incident down there.
Yeah, I don't even think it's debatable. He is the worst owner in all of North American professional sports. And that's a lot of owners we're talking about. NHL, NBA, NFL, and Major League Baseball. I was reading he's demanding that owners basically now identify him against future legal liability if he sells the Commanders, or he will sue, which that's going to piss off a lot of owners. But then I was also reading that he allegedly charged the Commanders $4.5 million to put a team logo on his private jet per multiple reports. And he allegedly also charged the franchise $10 million annually to use his own private jets. I mean, you want to talk about a guy with stones on him. I mean, just look at his track record. This is a losing friggin' franchise since he bought it. They're 164, 220, and 2. In 23 seasons, they've never passed the divisional round, and they've gone through 10 head coaches. I mean, my goodness, he had that cutoff where $6 billion. I think there was a max bid of 6.3. And what he's going to do, he's going to fight all his business partners. Like he's basically, what he's doing right now is he's like, well, if I'm going down, I'm taking people down with me, and I'm not going to roll over. And I understand all that, but you also have to cut your losses. Like what you're doing now is like just gutter rat stuff. I mean, it's like really low. It's like worse than street stuff. I mean, this is like, come on, man. I mean, and the fact, listen, if the NFL wanted to fix the image, and they're always talking about protecting the shield, then how do you not investigate this?
Yeah, there's going to come a certain point where the NFL as a whole, and Roger Goodell, a lot of the key owners that we always talk about, Robert Kraft and Jerry Jones and some of the other high-end owners in the league, yeah, they're going to probably say enough's enough. And you talk about Daniel Snyder over and over, he is lawyering up, and he feels like he has deeper pockets than a lot of people. And the NFL has huge pockets. They're a Park Avenue entity, more lawyers than anybody is always the big slogan. But they don't want to spend a ton of money in litigation in terms of fighting somebody. You saw that over the past couple of years in terms of the Tom Brady case and a couple of other ones where there was all those appeals, and those appeals to the circuit courts cost money. So, I think eventually Daniel Snyder, the pressure is going to be put on him, but it's going to take a lot, Q. And obviously it may take, a season to a year plus. And once again, you're talking about a team that's probably not going to do well in the standings, and their stadium's half filled. And when it does get filled, they're talking about it's everybody from the other team's fans, and it's just an ugly situation. So hopefully they can clean it up, and this team can move forward because they have had some success in their history.
Yeah, it's a good point with the stadium being empty too, or being overrun by other fans. Because think about it, in proximity to 95, you have the Giants and you have the Eagles, and if the Jets make a trek down there, Baltimore as well. But I just feel as though the league, the commissioner, I mean, he's in bed, obviously, because he's making the owners money. As the more money he makes, the more job security he has. But on the surface, it's the perception, right? It's the optics are really bad. And you mentioned them being bad. They hired Bieniemy. I think this might be it for Rivera, one more year. But then I take a step back and say he might get more grace because they don't have a quarterback. They just released Carson Wentz. We knew it was a formality. I tweeted out, what the hell has happened with Carson Wentz? I mean, think about this. He goes from being the Eagles savior, front runner to MVP, getting hurt in that Rams game on the road. Foles comes in, leads them to a Super Bowl win. They go back eventually to Carson Wentz. They draft Jalen Hurts. They bench Wentz. They jettison him to Indianapolis. He can't win a couple big games late against Jacksonville. And then he goes to Washington and he flames out. We know the NFL. We know how the quarterback carousel works in the NFL. But do you believe that Carson Wentz is still deemed a legit starter in the NFL, or is it by more of default, a team's going to pay for him that's desperate for a starting quarterback?
Yeah, and first and foremost, you talked about Bieniemy going there, and I think he's going to get his opportunity. Maybe Rivera step aside, and he's going to run that offense. And so you talking about he brings his offense from Kansas City Chiefs. He looks right in the cupboard. He says, "No, Carson Wentz, not the guy I'm going to work with." And you're right, Q. He's just digressed so much over the years. Last year in particular, the year before actually, when he was with the Colts, you really saw, Irsay invested so much in him, and then it was just strange that Washington said, no, he's our guy. he's still got something left. Bring him in and they give him that huge contract. Obviously, we knew this was going to happen before the league year started. He was due probably about $30 to $40 million in terms of, they were looking at him as being a backup quarterback, Sam Howell, the kid they drafted out of North Carolina. So, just not a lot left with him. And now he's just going to be one of those quarterbacks, he's going to be an asterisk. He's a guy you're going to talk about. Is he one of the biggest busts ever? Because after that injury against the Rams, where he didn't protect himself and he hurt his knee, he just was never the same guy. And then when you heard in the locker room, the backstory, though, before that injury, he just never endeared himself to his teammates.
Yeah.
And, you and I covering teams over the years, you're in the locker room, the quarterback has to be their guy and they have to believe in him. And this is just not worked in all three stops. And particularly with the Eagles, there was just so many, things that were not coming out that he just was not a member of the team and people did not like it, quite frankly. And then he got 2 chances with the Colts and then now with Washington, and it just has not worked out. I think in terms of injuries and his body and the way he's reading for the pocket, he'll be lucky to get a backup job at this point. It's a league where everybody knows everyone. So these coaches look at each other, looking at the tape, and they're saying, is he even worth it? And with his bad attitude, is he a guy that's going to be the good backup? Because they all want that Chase Daniel type, a guy who's just going to hold the clipboard and be buddies with everybody. And that's just not Carson Wentz.
No, it's not. And to your point, and I'm glad you kind of went into a little more detail, right? He's never been that team first type of player. And, he used to drive the coordinators absolutely batty and crazy, right? I mean, when you're basically going rogue and calling your own plays, and I think there's a lot to be desired with that kind of nonsense. I don't think he's a shot fighter, but I think his time in the NFL as a starter is done. But again, I kind of hedge it and say, you look at teams like Carolina, Tampa Bay, Atlanta just released Mariota. They're teams that are probably going to say, hey, we'll pay him $15 million as a bridge quarterback. I mean, that's just where we're at. In the NFL, I mean, Tampa, Carolina, they might be destinations. I mentioned Mariota got released today from Atlanta. Free agent Brissett's out there, Baker's out there, Carr's still out there. It's just when it comes, I feel as though we have this conversation every single solitary year in the NFL with these quarterbacks. It's like retread, right? And then you have the draft coming up in April, and I'm not entirely sold whether it's Young or Stroud. All of a sudden the hype machine that is Richardson, some mocks have Detroit trading up at 6, and then all of a sudden Richardson there, maybe to have him sit and be groomed by Goff, who's shown that he can be a franchise quarterback, at least for the next couple of seasons. I just think a team will pay Carson Wentz to be under center if they're that desperate come September. You know it, and I know it.
Well, a lot of things are going to have to come together. You're going to probably look at training camp injuries, underperformance, and all that. And you're right, Q. Maybe somebody will say, give them one more shot. A lot of these bonus baby first round former quarterbacks, they always get another chance. You see it over and over again. I almost hearken, the way it's looking right now. He's like Sam Bradford, who I always said stole more money than anybody. Former first overall pick. And he just kept getting chance after chance. And, former Heisman Trophy winner. And everybody said, oh, he just looked so great in his workouts. And he was a guy who did so well in interviews, but he just couldn't get it done on the field.
Nope. No.
And when you look at Carson Wentz, you're starting to wonder, is he a guy that just can't get it done on the field anymore? And, this is what happens. A lot of these former guys, they just kind of end up kind of drifting away. And you saw it kind of with Cam Newton. After a while, there was just no market for him. And he kind of said, you know what, I'm just going to retire. And that's that. But, injuries will happen and maybe he will get that chance. But, you look at maybe Tannehill might be right there too. You talk about Mariota. These are all guys who formerly teams put all their eggs in their basket with these guys and they just couldn't get it done.
Yep. 100%. Tuesday edition of BYP with Q. Rich Quinones here, Lloyd Vance joining us. And again, our Tuesday edition of BYP from our good friends over at One With Life Tequila. Check them out online, onewithlifetequila.com. we knew it was a formality with the Giants and Kenny Galladay. I mean, it's ridiculous. 60 something catches, 400 something odd yards, 72 million, and one touchdown reception, which came in garbage time in a meaningless regular season game against the Philadelphia Eagles. I mean, again, I'm looking around with some of these wide receivers. We talk Carson Wentz and what the heck happened. We look at Kenny Galladay. I think maybe those stats were kind of overblown in Detroit, and it turned out to be a historically horrible signing for the New York Football Giants. They had to get out of it. They did get out of it. They'll release him in about another week or so. But, you know, when you make those types of signings and they don't pan out, I can't sit there and say it sets a franchise back, because we're talking a wide receiver as opposed to a running back. I'm sorry, as opposed to a quarterback, Lloyd. But man, I'll tell you, buyer beware sometimes with these wide receivers, in different spots and different systems coming off big time seasons. And we know we're going to overpay for them, but that just blew up. I mean, the Giants have major egg on their face with that contract, because it was a horrible one.
Yeah, Q, and you talk about, this is going to go on the resume, most importantly, of probably the general manager. So the general manager, Joe Shane there, obviously he's there building his program. He's done a good job in terms of bringing in Brian Daboll. And he's looking and he's saying, you know what, I made a mistake. Good thing he got out of it after 1 year. A lot of these guys in the past would keep somebody on the roster year after year, deactivate them, still pay them, and would not admit a mistake. So, it is buyer beware. Free agency, I go back to like Albert Haynesworth. That was the big signing coming over from Tennessee Titans, going to Washington, and he just never panned out. And they paid so much money, and then they had to get rid of him. And they had dead cap space and all that. And it's definitely buyer beware. So I think a lot of the teams are looking at like a Kansas City Chiefs, who do most of their damage in terms of building a roster in the draft, where they're building, grabbing young players and maximizing them and then extending them once they get to, that contract year. So, the free agents, some of them will still get their money, but I definitely think teams are definitely going to make sure that they're not overspending for some of these guys. And Galladay was a prime case. He comes from Detroit, as you talk about. A lot of times their stats were inflated because they were behind in games, and he's catching passes in garbage time, like we call it, fantasy football stats. Yep. And the numbers look better than actual production. And then Brian Daboll comes in and he says, this guy can't get it done. And to his credit, they still made the playoffs without Galladay really contributing. Sterling Shepard, another guy who they're probably going to get rid of at the wide receiver position, was injured. And he went with some younger guys, and they were getting it done with Daniel Jones. We saw them win that playoff game and make some moves, which was totally a surprise.
Yeah, I mean, Galladay gone. They terminated the contract to Shepard. Too many injuries. Robinson comes back, hopefully off an injury. You still got Slayton. You saw Hodges. They brought him back. Richie James, they'll probably bring him back. You trade away Kadarius Toney. They're definitely going to go wide receiver shopping, but they should know, after this type of move, different regime, to not open up the checkbook. And quite frankly, they got to figure out what they're going to do with Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley as well. So, all right. So how big of an impact is Leslie Frazier, defensive coordinator, stepping down, taking a year off from coaching with the Buffalo Bills?
Q, that's going to be real interesting, because there was always that question. I know he kind of tutored Sean McDermott, who's the defensive-minded coach. He's the head coach, and they were always connected at hip. So it will be interesting. I think it's going to fall more on Sean now to call the defense on a day-to-day. And I'm hearing whispers out there that Sean may be on a mini hot seat. Sean McDermott's been with the Buffalo Bills for about 6 years now. They had the roster this year, had high expectations. Yep. Josh Allen, potential MVP candidate, and they just kind of fizzled out, whether it was injuries or what have you. So the Pegulios who own that team, they're definitely going to be keeping an eye on the situation. They have to retool. They have to rebuild that roster, and also that defense. They have some key free agents on that unit, and they're going to have to get Von Miller back. He's a guy who really was their linchpin, and they kind of went downhill after he got injured. So very interesting times in Buffalo, but yes, I think it will make some kind of impact.
I think also a formality with the Philadelphia Eagles, they'll be promoting their quarterback coach, Brian Johnson, to OC. Now, I guess the question is, will he call plays? that's yet to be seen. I mean, I think he's a bright mind. I think he's an up and comer. Listen, I think no matter what, he had a hand in, obviously, the growth. I mean, let's be honest here, right? Of Jalen Hurts to make that transition really from first time, full time, first year starter to second year starter full time in the NFL. And Hurts was arguably the NFL's MVP if he doesn't get hurt. Obviously, led the Eagles to the Super Bowl, in which they lost late to Kansas City. So I think it's a correct decision. That's a good move by Philadelphia.
It is, and you have Shane Steichen who moves on and takes the job, and with Indianapolis, it left it open. So Brian Johnson has been kind of the quarterback whisperer in terms of Jalen Hurts. They've known each other for quite some time. Johnson, a former pretty successful quarterback at Utah, knows how to run the read option in terms of a quarterback with mobility, coaching them. So very good relationship already there. And as you said, it was a no-brainer. Slide Johnson in, and Johnson needed that opportunity, because he'd been a quarterback's coach, but he wants to kind of make that ascension, maybe possibly being a head coach. So a good logical step for them, Q. In Philadelphia here where I am, everybody was questioning what's next for the defense. You've seen some of these other defensive coordinators get signed at other places because Gannon goes to the Cardinals. So some work to do defensively, but Combine Week may bring some stories.
All right, two more before I let you get out of here. Next week, we'll really kind of get into the offseason. I mean, the draft's about a month or so away, but we'll start breaking down some of these divisions and some of these team needs. This story with Byron Jones, the cornerback with the Dolphins, is really it's kind of disturbing because when players come out and they've dealt with injuries, or maybe they didn't have the type of year that they wanted, or they've just been cut or released, whatever the case may be. And you hear a story like this where a player basically is like, look, man, I can't jump, I can't run, I can't really do anything. And then he almost doubles down on it and says, well, the cause of it is pretty simple. Don't take any of the pills that they're giving you. Don't allow them to stick needles in you. Don't, allow them to inject you. I mean, where do you go when you hear something like this?
Q, the social media can be a detriment to players. And I know, teams, their PR staffs are always like, and their agents are like, be careful what you put out there. Obviously he deleted this stuff from his social media, but it can't be undone. You get people have screenshots, and Jones is a guy, he's a veteran, that's very surprising that he would go this route. He got the money in terms of Dallas, and then he's with Dolphins doing a good job. And you don't want to put out there that you're so injured that you can't play. And you want to, because obviously Miami's going to probably step away from him. And then who's going to sign him because he's damaged goods. So, he's got a lot of work to do, and it's a very ugly situation, but like Herm always said, be careful before you hit send. Be careful what you're putting out there before you hit send. Think before you hit send. And Byron Jones, he's a bad situation, and we'll just have to see how this thing works out.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't know if he's going to retire. You mentioned, he scrubbed it, he deleted, he kind of walked it back. He's played 8 years. I know he had he blew everyone away at the Combine in 2015. You mentioned the stops with Dallas. And now Miami, he was on the, I think the physically unable to perform list as well. But I guess my thing is, when a current player tweets something like that, or goes on social or a podcast or a radio station or a TV station and uses the words, don't take the pills, don't allow them to inject you, to me, that reeks of a bigger, deeper, darker issue. And now I'm wondering if the NFLPA, or if he's hasn't already had conversations with the NFLPA after this tweet has come out, because they're there to protect the player. At the end of the day, they want to do just and do good and do right by the player. So Dallas isn't going to comment. Miami's not going to comment. I don't know.
Yeah.
I guess my thing is, what's your motivation to come out and say this now? Because maybe you believe you're about to get cut, you're about to get released.
Right. And in the end, Q, he's biting hand that feeds him. and they're all in partnerships and in bed with each other. So whether it's the NFL Player Association led by DeMar Smith, and the TV networks that broadcast these games, they all have monetary ties to each other. And, DeMar Smith's going to do what's best to protect all the players. So that's like 1,600 players. So, and, they will close ranks. We've seen this before, Q. We talked about, was this guy blackballed? Was he pushed out of the league? Yeah, it can happen. So, Jones has definitely got a lot of groundwork that he's got to clean up. And I'm sure in front offices everywhere, and they're talking already about him and in terms of what he's put out there. Obviously, everyone knows that there's a situation in terms of these drugs that these guys are taking before games, and in terms of painkillers and all that, and the effects of that. We've seen that over and over again, because we've had players that have unfortunately killed themselves, and they point back to painkillers and the CTE and just the damage. These guys go through a ton just to get out there on Sundays. A lot of people forget there's human beings inside those helmets. And yes, this humanizes the story, but it could be a detriment to Jones's career.
Yeah, and that's where you kind of have to walk that tightrope, right? Where you have to just really be careful of what you say or what you put out, and that's the problem, right? Because these players are so quick to push, send and whatnot. So I was reading today, I don't know if you saw the story, I want to make sure I'm accurate. Was it Randy Cross they said had CTE?
I'm not sure. I didn't know if that one came out yet, but it's very probable, Q. It's just prevalent, in the movie Concussion a couple of years ago, Will Smith, that really shined a light on it. And then the NFL really started doing some more proactive things after years of kind of putting their heads in the sand. But once again, once the games start, everybody kind of seems to forget these things. And these veteran guys, unfortunately, a lot of them are very ill. So, I know they're trying to work on healthcare and things that sort to help these guys, but even that, there were problems where guys were in that lawsuit, and they were fighting them, not wanting to give them the money. So it's an ugly cycle. So
let me correct myself too. It was Irv Cross, who was great defensive.
One of the all-time in terms of broadcasting. One of the first players, former Philadelphia Eagles great, and then he came to the NFL today. And, he was a cornerstone guy. They were Brent Musburger, Phyllis George, Jane Kennedy. I mean, he was just phenomenal in terms of reporting. And that's not surprising. It's unfortunate, because he was a guy, after his career, he just did so much in terms of just showing that an athlete can do more after he's done playing the game. So unfortunate and not surprising. And there's a game, there's a price to pay. And a lot of people know about it now, but there's always going to be young men that want to play the game.
Yeah. Again, just to clarify, Irv Cross. I said Randy Cross, and Randy Cross is alive and well. So I just wanted to make that correction. All right. And then lastly, I said this a year or so ago. I think Russell Wilson is the biggest friggin' fraud maybe in the history of the NFL when we talk about all-time greats. Well, Brett Favre, and Aaron Rodgers, you guys have your own spot. But that bombshell report comes out that he tried to get Pete Carroll fired, and then he denies it. Listen, if you ask me, where there's smoke, there's fire. And I wouldn't, put it past him. I think he's that type of guy. And it's just, he just, to me, is a fake. He's a phony. He tries too hard to be something he's not. And I'm starting to look at Russell Wilson. Like, is he becoming the most hated player in the NFL?
Wow, Q. That Athletic report came out. That's Athletic Network. That article's pretty damaging. It was very thorough in terms of talking about him and his relationships with team members and the front office. And he was running amok with the Seattle Seahawks. And there was that organizational fight that you and I talked about. You asked me, you're like, Lloyd, who's going to win this? And I always thought it would be Wilson because, the quarterback that delivers the Super Bowl usually is the hero. But he, he bore out his welcome there. And then he goes to Denver, and they're talking about in Denver, he had his own office where he's working with his private quarterback trainer, and he's looking at film with young players, inviting them up to his office, which I was like, holy moly, I've never heard anything like this in all my time around the National Football League. Yes, usually when I went in the locker room, the quarterback had, two big stalls right at the front of the locker room, because he was the main guy, but it was nothing like, I'm in charge here. So you just see how that whole thing with Nathaniel Hackett just exploded, and he gets Hackett out of there. But it's going to be real interesting to see. Sean Payton's a no-nonsense kind of coach. He's coming in there, and, he has that cachet, and they've given him a lot to come to Denver in terms of a trade with New Orleans. So, it's going to be interesting soap opera this season with those two.
All right. Good stuff as always. Give Lloyd a follow on Twitter at Lloyd Vance. Kind enough to join us on a Tuesday edition of BYP. From our good friends over at One With Life Tequila. Check them out online, onewithlifetequila.com. At Rich Q on Q for myself, Twitter and IG social media, the like YouTube channel, Rich Q on Q. All right, next week we'll start to dive into these divisions. We'll kind of work our way from the AFC. We'll go down to the NFC. We'll close out with the NFC. We'll start to kind of get to where we think team needs, off-season moves. We'll really get into a nice little analysis and a deep dive into that. And I'll start to actually lay out. We got some future for win totals with some of these teams as well. So put your little betting hat on there, my friend, and we will definitely take you to task on that one next week. But I always appreciate a couple moments. Enjoy the rest of the week. And as always, Lloyd's always kind enough to join us on a Tuesday edition of BYP. Appreciate you, pal.
All right, Q. Thanks for having me on.